I'm Bill Roberts. I'm past president of the college, and because I'm a past president, I get to introduce a president's lecture. And I have the honor today of introducing my longtime friend and colleague, Douglas J. Casa, PhD, FACSM, for his president's lecture entitled Preventing Sudden Death in Sport and Physical Activity, the Struggles and Successes to Implement Evidence into Clinical Practice. Now, I can't tell you exactly when I met Doug, but it was probably at one of these ACSM meetings. I know that he slept in the back seat of his car to attend one meeting because the hotels were too expensive for his budget as a student, but he was dedicated. I also know that he experienced and survived an episode of heat stroke at age 16 in a track meet, which is really an event that triggered and shaped his whole career path. Doug received his master's in athletic training from the University of Florida in 1993 and his PhD in exercise physiology at the University of Connecticut in 1997. Now, I find these dates unbelievable because when I look at him, he still looks 16 to me. But he stayed at the University of Connecticut, where he is currently a professor in the Department of Kinesiology, the chief operating officer and founder of the Corey Stringer Institute, and the director of the Athletic Training Education Program. He's approaching 200 peer-reviewed publications in his research areas of expertise, which include hydration issues, exertional heat illness, heat stroke, body cooling, heat tolerance, and heat tolerance with respect to various ergogenic aids. He's done extensive research related to maximizing athletic performance in the heat and preventing sudden cardiac death and sudden death. He's been heavily involved in NATA and ACSM throughout his career. He's received the NATA Most Distinguished Athletic Trainer Award in 2013, the NATA President's Challenge Award in 2012, the NATA Service Award in 2018, and he was inducted into the University of Florida Alumni Hall of Fame in 2012. Doug has worked tirelessly to educate athletes, providers, coaches, sports organizations, and the public about heat and hydration issues to improve athlete safety. He also volunteers at events and works on the sidelines, where he's been involved in the care of over 200 athletes with exertional heat stroke, all of whom have survived. I can't think of a better person to present this President's Lecture, and would you please welcome me, or join me in welcoming Doug Casa.
Thank you, my friend. So truly an honor to be here today and to be able to give this talk at ACSM. Dr. Roberts has been a friend of mine for at least the last 15 years, and honored to have him introduce me. And he is correct that he said the very first professional meeting I attended was back in 1994, and I did stay in the back of my car, sleep there for 4 nights while I attended that meeting because I was so interested in being at this meeting but had no money to make that happen. So it gives you an idea of some of the interest and love I have for ACSM. And I have attended every single meeting except one since '94 till today. So it's exciting. So I'm going to give you a little bit of I'm going to intertwine my personal story with the current kind of national story of us trying to make policy changes related to sport and physical activity. And I hope that you guys will find it interesting. So for me, the story starts back in 1985, as was mentioned by Dr. Roberts. 1985, I was entering my senior year of high school, and it was the real story probably starts in July of that year, where they had the qualifying races for the Empire State Games for the Long Island region. Long Island is made up of over 100 high schools for public and private, and 2 people make it in every single track event to represent the Long Island region. The Empire State Games is a summer Olympic festival that they have for like lacrosse, wrestling, basketball, soccer, track, and swimming. And for me growing up, it was a very, very big deal to ever make an Empire State Games team. It was so big that after 9th grade, I tried out, and I took dead last in the 10K qualifying race. I'm talking about dead last. I was lapped by probably half the people in the race. And I came home that night, and my brothers laughed at me, of course, and my dad thought I was crazy, and other people, all my friends and teammates thought I had no chance. I wasn't even the best runner on my own team in high school, and I still went to try out. And my mom was the only one who said, you stick with it. You know, this could work out someday. So I went back after 10th grade, and I took 5th place in the qualifying race. And then I went back again in July of '85 after 11th grade, my last opportunity to qualify as a high school runner, because I'll obviously have graduated next year. And I tied for 1st place to qualify for the Empire State Games. So it had meant a lot to me. I'd really wanted to make Empire State Games for probably about 6 years. So on August 8th of 1985 was my 10K race. And as I mentioned, obviously making that race meant so much to me. So you can imagine towing the line that day. I had a legitimate chance of medaling based on my times and like where I was seated and based on how the times of the other people who qualified. The problem was, on that particular day, it was a heat wave in Buffalo, and it was about 90 degrees, and they had the wisdom of starting the race at noontime for a 10K race on the track, 25 laps on the track, and they're starting it at noon. So just to give you an idea, that evening, they had the sprints under the lights at 8 o'clock, the 100 and 200 meter race. No risk of heat stroke, they're running at 8 o'clock at night. 25 laps, we're running at noontime, okay? No water was provided during the race, and it was a black track, and one of the medical staff there said the track surface was between 130 and 140 degrees that day. So when I towed the line that particular day, I obviously knew nothing about heat illnesses at that time, but I was extremely interested in running my hardest, and I did. And at the 24th lap with the bell lap, I was even with the 2 other runners in the race, and we were tied for 1st place, 3 of us going for 1st. And I still distinctly, it's one of the last memories I have, distinctly remember looking back just to see where 4th place was, because I was like, if it doesn't work out, at least am I going to get a medal? And 4th place was a half a lap behind. So I knew basically we were all going to get medals. It's just going to be a matter of which color. Well, with 200 meters to go, and I had felt the best in my life up to that moment as a runner, and I had nothing wrong with me, and I didn't feel anything different. With 200 meters to go, I collapsed and face down on the track. I got back up within a second because the only thought going through my head was I'm going to get a medal if I finish the race. And I popped up, and I actually sprinted and almost regained contact. And with 50 meters to go, just before the finish line, I collapsed again. And this time I collapsed, and I did not wake up for 7 hours. I was in a coma, and I had suffered an exertional heat stroke. So on that particular day, obviously shaped a lot of the things that would come. But I think the biggest moment for me that particular day was that night when I was taken out of intensive care at about 10:45. Long Island is 10 hours from home, so a lot of the other people hadn't made it yet because of my serious illness that I suffered. And I was actually alone in my room, and I asked the nurse to turn on the TV. And 11 o'clock, the local news was on, and the lead story on the local news was me collapsing on the track. So I think of actually visually seeing and hearing about yourself, that shaped, I could never shake that image of me struggling, getting up, collapsing, and that being the lead story on the news. And ironically, in the room next to me was a road cyclist who had a heat stroke on the same exact day at the Empire State Games. And they were talking about him for the next story after my story. And then the next morning, I see him in the hallway. I was like, the two of us had suffered a heat stroke. So that obviously shaped a lot for what happened to me and for the things that took place afterwards. So the next part of this story I think that's important to tell was in 2001. 2001 was important for a lot of different reasons. The first part of the story is Los Angeles in June 2011. I was giving a presentation after winning an award for the NATA at a research meeting. And during my presentation, a lady left my presentation after I was talking about my heat stroke. So the irony of this is the first time I publicly spoke about my heat stroke was at that talk in June of 2011. A lady who was in the room, Cindy Trowbridge, who's a professor at University of Texas at Arlington now, she had been a former student of the athletic trainer who saved my life and had heard the heat stroke story from that man while she was in class, and then had heard the story from me. And she put 2 and 2 together that the person that had originally been saved back in 1985 was me, and the person who did the saving was her teacher that she'd heard like in 1991 or 2 in a classroom. So this was another powerful moment for me, because when my talk was done, out in the hallway, she had found him at the conference, and I meet the person who saved my life, which was a staggering moment for me. Ken Scriber is his name, who I ended up becoming very, very good friends with since 2001. And he he had no idea who he had saved that day. It was just a runner from Long Island that he actually checked in on over the next few days to see how things had gone. And it was really he who started the path to me living that day, because he knew within a second it was heat stroke, immediately started cooling me on site, and immediately demanded cooling to happen during the ambulance. And then I had amazing care at the hospital from the nurses and the doctors as well. But the most amazing part of that story is that in 2001, he found out that it was I who he saved. And in the previous 3 or 4 years, when he was teaching heat stroke in his class, he was handing out articles that I had authored. Doug Cass's articles about heat stroke to teach his class, had no clue that while he was giving his case study example of heat stroke, that the person who authored the paper was the guy he saved back in 1985. So this is another part of my life kind of coming full circle with some of these issues. But another really, really important thing that happened in 2001, about 6 weeks after that presentation that I just mentioned, is that August 1st, 2001, we should kind of all recognize as Heat Stroke Day, I think, in our country, because it's when everything really gets serious with high school football and the training at the high school level. On that day, we lost Travis Stowers, a high school football player in Indianapolis, and we lost Eros Otan, a college football player at the University of Florida, and we lost Corey Stringer, a pro player in the NFL. We lost a high school, college, and pro player all on the same day from exertional heat stroke. And that was a very important day in terms of things moving forward for the opportunities I have now. So when we take this forward now from 2001, and the litigation that took place after Corey Stringer passing away, I assisted his widow for 9 years. Okay? And the final litigation was her settlement with the NFL. And when she settled with the NFL, the evening of the settlement, her lawyer and Commissioner Goodell reached out to me and asked if we would be interested in having the lasting legacy of Corey be at the University of Connecticut because of our distinguished history of heat and hydration research long before I got there. And my connectivity, obviously, with Kelsey and with the lawyers and the trust that we had built up over those years. So in 2010, at April 23rd at the NFL draft at the Radio City Music Hall, we officially opened the doors of the Corey Stringer Institute in terms of us being founded. So the question is, and we really didn't fully understand at that point how much we'd be able to do at KSI. All the stuff we do at KSI, I had a big interest in prior. We were always working on policy changes and research and education, but now we had this vehicle that gave us even more opportunities. And this, I know, is going to be small for some of the people in the back, but the bottom line is that about 4 items cause over 90% of the deaths that happen in sport. Okay? It's cardiac, it's heat stroke, it's head injuries, and exertional sickling. So 4 different causes of death account for over 90% of all the deaths that take place. And almost all of those deaths are actually preventable with proper precautions that are in place. So a lot of what we do is geared towards those efforts. This slide is powerful. This is only data specific to football. But if you look at the top, the direct causes of death in football at all causes, all levels, high school, youth, through pro, has dropped off precipitously from the 60s, peaked at 244 in a decade, which is enormous, if you could imagine, down to the previous decade of 41. And that's things like the top is direct fatalities in football, so head injuries, neck injuries, organ injuries. The bottom is indirect deaths in football, and you can notice that we're in a 3-decade increase from the 80s up through now of death, and that would be things like cardiac, heat stroke, and exertional sickling. And the news is not promising because I know now that we're more than halfway through the decade currently, and I work closely with the process of collecting this data, and that we're definitely going to have another increase for this next decade for indirect, and probably a sizable increase actually again. So we're constantly asked, why are we having an increase in deaths from these particular causes? And that's some of the things I'll talk about today and things we should all consider on what we could do to try to stem this tide. So this is just an example last year from July 1st through December 15th, only looking at one sport and only one level, only high school football. And you can get an idea in just that 5-month window, you have 17 deaths happen. And almost all of those deaths, now that we can look back on them retrospectively, almost all of them, including some of the contact ones, were preventable. Okay? So there's a lot we can do to make sure tragedies like this don't happen. And those are the ones that lead to death up there. There's a lot of things that cause long-term complications that also could be prevented. When we look specifically at the heat stroke numbers, and we look at them in 5-year blocks, we also have an increase in the number of heat stroke deaths at the high school and college level, which is staggering for me when you consider that heat stroke treatment is 100% effective when done appropriately, and that we're still having this climb in deaths, and we constantly have to ask ourselves what's happening within these infrastructures that are causing these numbers to occur. So today I'm going to focus on 6 specific items, and I know there could be like 20 we could focus on. I'm only going to touch on each of these. But these 6 items, I'm going to talk about where we are right now with particular policy changes. And I'm going to start with heat acclimatization. So first I'm going to bring this back in later to the story from Arkansas. Arkansas has an interesting tale to tell. You may recognize there's a PBS Frontline had an amazing show about these 3 cases of heat stroke. Will James, high school football player, Tyler Davenport, a high school football player, and Logan Johnson, a youth basketball player, all had heat stroke within 1 day of each other in Arkansas. And unfortunately, Tyler Davenport passed away from his heat stroke, and Will James was hospitalized for a couple months, as was Logan. But there was a lot of interesting movement after this took place. A lot of the work that we do at KSI is not your traditional stand in front of people and tell people what they should do. We actually try to get within systems and make changes on an infrastructure within the infrastructure. At this house, and he may be in the room right now, but Dr. Matt Gagno, who's a professor at the University of Arkansas, was gracious enough to let us use his house for an afternoon and evening one day. And we invited in the leading coaches in the state of Arkansas, football coaches, the state champion football coaches, the leaders from the State High School Athletic Association, the leadership from the Sports Medicine Advisory Committee, leadership from the 2 biggest hospitals in the state, leadership from the key team physicians and athletic trainers, the key researchers in the state. And then we also brought in 4 families that were influenced by heat stroke. Rhonda Fincher lost her son in 1995 from heat stroke in Arkansas. This is the parents of the Davenports who had recently lost their child. This is Logan's dad, and this is the mom and dad of Will James. So they were in the room with all these other people while we spent the afternoon and evening together. And it just gives you an example of some of the work that we try to do to try to influence some of the change. And very proud to say the next day, the Football Coaches Association in the state of Arkansas voted to approve all of the changes that were needed for heat. Not that they had any influence on the state, but just as a show of support, the state high school football coaches for Arkansas voted to approve as a show of moral support to encourage the state to make some of those changes. And it's those kind of personal connections, I think, that can go a long way. But when we talk about heat acclimatization, a lot of the important work in the field dealing with football players comes from Mike Ferrara and the work he's done at the college level and at the high school level. And this is an example of some of the heat illness data that happens over the course of the first week when someone's outside. And blue is more mild heat illnesses and red is more severe. But you can see a precipitous drop in the number of heat illnesses over the course of the first week. Heat acclimatization, for people who don't normally live within this world, is the gradual physiological changes that happen to your body over the course of the first 7 to 10 days of exercise in the heat. And basically the bottom line is you have better exercise heat tolerance after having exercise heat sessions over the course of a week. The bottom line piece of data that's important for everyone here to understand is that over 80% of all heat stroke deaths happen in the first 3 days that you start activity in the heat. So if we can do more to protect people in the first 3 days, we're probably going to be successful in reducing the incidence of deaths from heat stroke. This is an example of the NCAA's guidelines related to heat acclimatization that they adopted in 2003. So keep in mind the years. 2001, they lost Eros Satan at the University of Florida. 2003, they adopted sweeping heat acclimatization changes, basically that were very similar to military guidelines from the late 80s and early 90s, but that we had never seen within the confines of organized sport yet in America. And they made quite an effort to make this extremely comprehensive. And this is the bottom line from the NCAA data. From 2003, when they implemented their data, to today, they have only had 1 heat stroke death in college football in August. In totality, they were averaging 2 per year in August prior to their adaptation of the heat acclimatization policies. And you can do the math out. It was between 1.5 and 2 per year beforehand. And so that massive lives being saved for absolutely no cost It's just simply modifying the number of practices and the amount of equipment over the course of the first week. So the problem now at the high school level is we wanted to have similar implementation at the high school level, but you have to change policies state by state. So we would need all 50 states to make changes. And then you also have to change them for public and for private. So you really have to have 100 different organizations make the change if you want heat acclimatization for football, as an example, at the high school level. So to credit Dave Salon, he reached out to us at UConn in 2006. And I encouraged him to try us to get a working group together of leaders in the country related to the science of heat acclimatization. And the result was this document in 2009 to try to have a guideline that we can encourage schools to adapt. And that was kind of our starting line for us. So as I mentioned, we really wanted to try to control the first week of practices. No two-a-days for the first 5 days, no successive days of two-a-days after that period, phasing in of the amount of equipment, controlling the length of practice times. So this is what the country looked like. The ones in blue, okay, did not have heat acclimatization standards as of May 1st, 2011. So we had written the document in 2009. Keep in mind the NCAA did it in 2003. Okay? So we are now a full 8 years later, and we still don't have one state that meets the same minimum standards that the college level adopted back in 2003. So thankfully, Dave Salon, who started that whole process, he got New Jersey to be the first state to adopt those guidelines in 2011. And Texas was the second to follow suit. And if you understand or follow in any way high school football in America, having Texas on board was a massive step forward, because you can try to visualize the meeting I'm having. And just so you know, personally, I've visited 33 states so far to try to get this policy adopted. Okay? And our staff has visited many more of the states. So we have, picture the meeting I'm having in Rhode Island, and they have 23 high school football players in their whole state. I'm kidding. Okay? But you can imagine that I say that they're like, we can't do it, it's a change of tradition, we want to do two-a-days on the first day. I'm like, if the state of Texas did it, I am absolutely sure Rhode Island could adopt these policies. Okay? So Texas was a huge movement. Mike Carroll deserves a lot of the credit there for really working his butt off to get that policy approved. Georgia, 2012, was the next state. They made sweeping changes, which I'll talk about in a minute. Mike Ferrara, Ron Corson, Bud Cooper, and others deserve credit there. But they, like many of the other states that I'm going to show you, often have to respond to tragedies that have taken place and not having people make proactive changes, which we'll talk about. North Carolina, I'm going to test my geography here. The Arkansas, Arizona, Florida, Connecticut, of course, we needed, Iowa, Nebraska, I'm not sure, Utah, and others. And even Rhode Island is in there, as I mentioned earlier. Alabama, Mississippi, there's Nebraska. And Hawaii just came on board a couple weeks ago. So this is where we're at today. The other ones here in yellow are other ones that we're very close and actively working with right now. But it gives you an idea. We've spent a lot of our effort in the Southeast because that's where most of the heat stroke deaths happen. So we've wanted to put a lot of our resources that we have at KSI to try to make sure the changes are in the states that we think could have the biggest influence as quickly as possible. Obviously, we're not going to, although it'd be nice to have trips to Alaska and Montana, but they don't have as many problems with the heat. So this is a smattering. The black dots are where heat stroke deaths had taken place prior to the heat acclimatization standards coming into play. And this is powerful here. This are the ones that have approval, not including Hawaii, because that was just a couple weeks ago. They haven't gone through a summer with the policy yet. They have not had a black dot since they have adopted the heat acclimatization standards, which is staggering. These are massive football states, big populations, very hot and humid conditions. There is one black dot in Florida, which actually kind of proves our point. They had a heat stroke death, but on the very first day, they had a two-a-day workout. They were not following the state's heat acclimatization standards, so it actually proves the point of why we need heat acclimatization standards. So this alone, to credit Sarah Antanasio and Will Adams and some of the other staff at KSI, they have a publication that's coming out in a few weeks. And we actually tried to do the math out. How many deaths would have happened in those particular states if they had not adopted heat acclimatization? If you look at the numbers from 1980 all the way through whenever they adopted the standard. And in the ballpark, we have saved approximately 15 to 20 lives just in those red states, just from one policy. So everyone working together in those states making that happen. So that's heat acclimatization, a little snapshot. Second is AEDs. The leading cause of death in sport by far is cardiac. The single greatest thing we could ever do is have accessible AEDs. And I know American Red Cross and American Heart Association and others advocate for sometimes 5 minutes or 3 minutes, but we at KSI recommend an AED be available within 1 minute within the confines of all organized sport. If you have a high school sports program and you're out on a field with 500 athletes at all different sports, there should be an AED there, all right? So this is some of the data. Very interestingly, 69 or 70% of all the cardiac arrests happen in 3 sports. We don't completely understand why that is, so these are sports we probably should spend even more of our efforts in to make sure an AED is extremely accessible. So applying an AED as soon as possible is the key for surviving a cardiac condition. And the recent data by Dr. Dresner really pans this out. If you look to the far, the second from the end, about 90% of people who have an AED placed within a couple minutes survive the cardiac arrest. So we don't need to have people die, 90%. Okay? And if you remember a figure like this, if you're in sports medicine, we had traditionally been told through the years that every minute that passes, survivability drops about 10%. And that actually is what the data has showed us from Dr. Dresner. And that's why we're not willing to give up any more percentage points. If we can get it on within a minute, why not live within that range? So when it comes to preparedness with AEDs, it's not just about having the AED there, but an emergency action plan, all the staff and coaches, and even in an optimal situation, like the work Beth Mallon's doing with advocates for injured athletes, having the athletes trained and educated as well is a very smart move. Education in CPR and AED, access to defibrillation, understanding and practicing and rehearsing the EAP, and integration of the AED into the local EMS system. Okay, so this is the trick to trying to have things change. I don't have a particular map for this one. We have it at our website, and I don't have time to go through all of the state evolving policy changes, but you could always go to our website and see the current state of 8 different policies in every state, and we give a complete overview of the status of each one. The third one is coaching education. Advocating for the implementation of continuing education standards for coaches, and not just CPR, first aid, AED. Having education related to preventing sudden death in sport like the state of Georgia requires. They actually have to have an hour course, because first aid, CPR, AED, you don't cover heat stroke and exertional sickling and emergency action plans. These are things that should be part of any coach's education, especially at the high school level. These are some of the things we look for when we try to evaluate if a state has adequate coaching education. And these are some of the top line items. So one example that we're a huge fan of is a program called Heads Up Football. Heads Up Football is a very comprehensive education program that teaches the coaches how to properly teach tackling and blocking. It teaches them about equipment fitting. It teaches them about sudden cardiac arrest. It teaches them about hydration and heat stroke, and it teaches them about concussions. And coaches get certified as Heads Up Football certified. So what's been powerful from this is that we have some powerful data now that has come out, 2 big pieces of data that have come out in just the last 6 months or so. Zach Kerr published, along with Dr. Urigan at the University of South Carolina and other colleagues from Dataless, looking at some of this data. And they had found a massive drop in concussions, for instance, as well as many other conditions when the coaches are properly trained and certified. Another really powerful data, this is crazy in terms of how effective this was, in the Fairfax County School District, which is one of the 10 largest school districts in America. They found, as you can see here, concussions in football was a 43% reduction if they were Heads Up Football certified coaches versus not. Okay, and all injuries actually had a 24% reduction. And that was just football, and they have very similar data from other sports because they actually had coaches in other sports go through it, because besides for the actual tackling, blocking part of Heads Up Football, that education program is relevant for any coach. Fourth one is modify exercise based on environmental conditions. So the concept of wet bulb globe temperature, this has had amazingly good success in the military, and in laborer situations, but we've been very slow to adapt this at the high school setting to try to protect our athletes. So give you an example here, August 2011, DJ Searcy and Forrest Jones, within a couple days of each other in the state of Georgia, both passed away from exertional heat stroke. One of the great tragedies here is that 5 years earlier, the state of Georgia had had another heat stroke death, and their state legislators adopted a new policy that every single high school had to have a wet bulb globe temperature or a heat index policy. The problem is that they let every single school develop their own individual policy. So to mock the law, some of the schools set their policy at 150 degrees for heat index, and we have evidence of a particular school that did 150 degrees that they would make modifications if it reached 150. Okay? Just so you know, in America, in recorded temperatures, there's only a couple locations that ever reached 150 heat index. Okay? So they obviously were mocking the particular law. Well, 5 years later, on the same day, on brutally hot days, these two individuals died, and there was no adequate modifications in place for either of them. DJ's story is one I know particularly well, and he was at a football training camp, and he struggled during day one, was found unconscious in his cabin that evening. They took him out of the shower, brought him back to his bed, didn't call an ambulance, and didn't call his parents. And then he came around, and they had him out of practice the next morning. He struggled again, and they made him do a time-mile run with the team at noon. He collapsed unconscious. They brought him back to the cabin and still hadn't called an ambulance. Okay? Then he went into cardiac arrest that afternoon, right, and he passed away. One of the teammates took a picture of him that you could actually find online and let his parents know what was happening the second day. I'm just giving you an example of some of the things that unfortunately we have to deal with. So this is an example of they now made some massive changes after that, the state of Georgia, and I give them a lot of credit because the people who took control of the State High School Athletic Association was a much better avenue in this circumstance to make real effective change instead of the state legislator. And they had the wisdom to collect data over the course of a number of years to see what wet bulb globe temperature actually affected the change. And to their credit, the State High School Athletic Association attended a meeting that Ron Corson and Mike Ferrara organized. And to the credit of Coach Richt, who is the head football coach at Georgia, he let us use his conference room in the football training facility. And each morning that we met for 3 days. Each morning that we met, he started the morning out, the head coach, and sat there and talked to all the football coaches and all the people in the State High School Athletic Association. And he said, we're going to make these changes. We're going to protect high school football players. And then he left the room, and he came back 8 hours later to get an update. Okay? So very, very classy efforts to use his power to try to protect other people. And those coaches were like, yes, sir, we'll make the changes. So it was very helpful to try to make those changes. But Mike Ferrara had the data to actually back it up. And he had specific data related to the wet bulb globe temperature. From here, you can see 82, 83, 84, 85 range. You get the spike in the heat illnesses. So that's obviously where we should start making modifications to practice sessions. And first of its kind, they did that. This is their specific guidelines now that they have. You can see the example at the top. Provide at least 4 separate rest breaks, each 4 minutes of length during every hour. So that's 16 minutes in those particular conditions that you know the person will not be exercising. They'll have time for their temperature to drop down, and they'll have ample time to hydrate. You obviously need more time to hydrate in hotter conditions because your sweat rate's higher. And this gives you an example of very specific guidelines. So the individual schools don't now have the policies in their hands. Okay? The state established the guidelines for them, which makes the most sense because the likelihood of each school having a thermal physiologist added is very unlikely. And we would need the experts like Mike Ferrara and the climatologist there, Andy Grunstein, and others who came up with guidelines that made a lot of sense based on data. This is some of the things we look for with wet bulb globe temperature. These, again, are at the KSI website, and we have all the states ranked in terms of which of these policies they follow or not. Right now, Georgia has the most comprehensive guidelines that we really would like to see other states adapt. One thing that Dr. Grunstein has found at the University of Georgia, who's done a lot of the work in this area, is that almost all the heat stroke deaths happen when the wet bulb globe temperature is more than 2 standard deviations above the norm for that place on that day. So it's extreme for that person at that moment. It's not comparing Maine temperatures to Louisiana to Montana to California. It's on that day, it's a really hot day, so you should make modifications. And in fact, almost all the heat strokes happened, over 90%, when it was more than one standard deviation above the mean for that day. Okay? So that's some powerful data to why we would make modifications region-wide based on your environmental conditions. The fifth one is exertional heat stroke care, an area that's near and dear to my heart. So another example or story is Max Gilpin, who was a high school football player in Louisville, Kentucky. Max Gilpin is a very interesting story. For people, some people may know this story. His coach was the first person in America criminally charged for his role in his death. There's always obviously been civil lawsuits, but this is the first example of a criminal case. It was reckless homicide the coach was charged with when Max Gilpin passed away from heat stroke. So I testified in that criminal trial for about 8 hours on one day. The coach was David Jason Stinson. And here you can see the cooling timeline that Max collapsed at 6:10. And you can see at 7:22 at the hospital, he's still 105.6. Okay? The key to surviving heat stroke is getting your temperature under 105 within 30 minutes. That's why we advocate for on-site cooling, cold water immersion tubs, on-site rectal temperature assessment, things like that. Here you can see, and you can do the math out, that you're 82 minutes in, and he's still over that threshold that would certainly continue to cause organ damage. So what's particularly sad about this case is that the coach for the second hour of practice was mad with his athletes, and he decided to change the rest of the practice session. So the last hour, he didn't do traditional football practice. He changed it to a conditioning session. And that last hour, he had 8 people fall out of practice from heat illness. Okay, 8 people. And it was day 15 of practice, so they're fully heat acclimatized, fully in shape, and he had 8 people fall out of practice. 2 were hospitalized, okay? And 1, Max Gilpin, passed away from his heat stroke that day. He still obviously could have survived, but he didn't have the good fortune of having appropriate care on site. There was no athletic trainer there, and there's a bunch of things that need to be said about that particular circumstance. This is obviously a particularly tragic situation when we have a coach that's basically providing a punishment during a workout, and then there's no care being provided for this individual. It's a very unique case, too, that we learned so much that we often don't get a glimpse of, because at the same exact time that this punishment session was happening, there was a home women's girls soccer game happening. That girls' soccer game, the visiting sideline was right next to the football practice field. So there was parents who stopped watching their own kid play soccer, who turned around and started just watching the football practice. Because you can imagine 8 kids collapsed just on the ground during this time. They just collapsed. That guy's laying there, another one's laying there. No one went to them, no one stopped anything. They kept doing the workout. 8 people, and these parents are mortified because they were sitting here watching these kids. Is like, anyone going to take care of them? Is anyone going to call for help? And so you got a very unique insight that we often don't get, because they didn't really have any connectivity to the school. And when they were interviewed, you got some amazing insights to what happened on that particular day. I had a very unique thing happen in my life here, that 2 weeks before the trial, I came to the school to visit the school to understand the logistics of where the field was, they actually had a tub inside the locker room that they used just for after practice, and I wanted to get an idea of distances and all those kinds of things. Well, give you an idea of the community completely rallied around the coach, okay? Because that's just the way the mentality was. And when I arrived on that campus, I had to have police escort, and judge approved that I could be on that high school campus. And when I arrived, the high school team was like lining the entrance because they knew I was coming. So the whole high school football team lined the entrance. And when I got back to the football field, there was an L section in the back of the field where there was a bunch of houses. And once I arrived, the houses emptied out with parents and siblings and kids to just surround me while I was on the field, because I only had 20 feet from the judge gave me of security from the police. So all these people just surrounded me, obviously to try to intimidate me in terms of how my testifying would go 2 weeks later. That morning when I left my house, my wife kind of figured I would never make it home from this particular trip. She did for real, because there was horrible stuff being written online about my being involved with this particular case. And she says, there's never been a criminal case in America. She's like, when you're there, she's like, think of the movie they're going to make someday. Call me up. Tell me about the scene of the movie. That's her exact words as I left the house. And well, ironically, 2 kids on dirt bikes both stayed within the zone of their distance that they were allowed to be. And they both revved their dirt bike engines the entire time I was on the field. I could not hear a word anyone said, because there was no sound limitation that the judge had provided in this case. So I called my wife up from the middle of the field, and I'm like screaming on the phone, like, I know the scene of the movie. And I'm yelling on the phone to her. And so she found that humorous, and she had predicted that very well. But it gives you an idea of the world that we're in, that the community didn't rally around the kid who died. They rallied around the coach who implemented this punishment session. So it gives you a little an idea of the uphill battle we face. When we talk about exertional heat stroke care, many of you heard me talk about this previously, but rectal temperature, cold water immersion, cool first, transport second are really the mantras for assuring proper care. We had a position statement released in 2012 that was a collective look at different ways or causes of death, but it provides a very brief oversight of this particular item. And I constantly ask, and I have to say within a room of this size, is helpful that we can all help educate other people. People always ask me, why do I need a rectal temperature? I'm just going to put them in a cold water immersion tub, and I'm going to cool them, and they'll be fine from their heat stroke. The problem is that in reality, there's a lot of reasons that can cause CNS dysfunction for an athlete. And rectal temperature helps verify what the condition is. And very importantly, it helps us decide when to remove them from the cold water bath. And that cold water bath should be at the field. You should have policies approved with your EMT and EMS providers that you're doing the cooling on site before they are shipped to the hospital. And you could have someone start, in my career, I've had a heat stroke as high as 112 I've treated. And I've treated 215 heat strokes so far in my career. I've had a 112, a 111, and 2 110s. So you could, if you take someone out of a tub at a set time, say 20 minutes, they could still be severely hypothermic at 107, and you're still going to die from the heat stroke. Okay? You need to have the constant monitoring on site while the cooling is taking place. So if you send someone to a hospital right away, you're looking at usually a minimum before they start cooling at the hospital of 45 minutes. It could be 5 minutes before you place the call, 10 minutes for them to arrive, 10 minutes on site, 10 minutes back to the hospital. And very few hospitals in America are ready to aggressively treat a heat stroke victim that just suddenly walks in or comes in on a rig in an emergency room. The Falmouth model is one of the great places that I've learned in being able to study exertional heat stroke. Last year, we had 42 heat strokes at the Falmouth road race, all in 1 hour and 15 minutes. Okay? We had 55 other heat exhaustions, so basically 100 people were treated in less than 1.5 hours. And you get an idea of how effective the immediate rectal temperature assessment, the cold water immersion, and things like that. This is a data that we published last year, the largest data set ever of exertional heat stroke, 274 heat stroke victims that all lived if rectal temperature and cold water immersion were instituted within 10 minutes of collapse. You could see 100% survival, and even home discharge. We only had to send a very small percentage to the hospital. We have proper physician supervision and clearance afterwards. And it shows you basically how it's basically almost like a magic potion, the cold water immersion, where someone's from near death, and within a few hours later, they're literally on the beach with their kids after their race. And how it could go in a totally different direction if someone's not aggressively cooled. The protocol obviously can be found at our website, and our recent NATA position statement on heat illnesses came out in the fall. That gives great depth related to this. The last item is safe conditioning sessions that I want to review. In 2012, we had an inter-association task force on trying to prevent deaths in collegiate conditioning sessions. I mentioned to you before, in college football, they've only had 1 death from heat stroke in August, but they've actually had a big rise in heat stroke deaths. And the reason is they happen at other times of the year. Okay? They also have sickling deaths that take place, and a lot of them have to do with very poor practices that take place during conditioning sessions. So one of our goals was to try to address this. And some of you may know that the leading cause of death in college football from 2000 to today actually is exertional sickling. So in 2010, they adopted a massive policy change that all athletes would have to be tested, and education would have to take place for the staff and for athletes who were tested positive. So if you look at the data up to that point, there were 21 deaths total in NCAA between sickle cell trait, heat stroke, and cardiac from 2000 to 2010. 11 of the 21 happened on the first or second day of starting a conditioning session, whether it be January or after spring break or July. So again, it shows you the importance of those initial days. And that's the 11 of 21 on the first or second day, and it was 17 of 21 happened in the first week of a conditioning. So the transitional periods are 5 weeks of the year account for 75% of the deaths. That's staggering. So that's the week they come back in January, the week after spring break, the week they start conditioning like in May, the week they start in July. So almost all the deaths happen in a very small portion of time. The other, think about that, 47 weeks of the year, there's 25% of the deaths. So obviously they're concentrated around a particular area, and that could give us obviously a specific area where we can target to make changes. So when they adapted the guidelines in 2010, these new sickle cell trait guidelines have had a massive influence in decreasing deaths from exertional sickling. There's been only 1 death from exertional sickling from 2010 till today, and there was 10 in the previous 10-year stretch. So if you look at this graph right here, that gives you an idea of approximately 10, there was 10 deaths in that 10-year stretch, and all the way up through today, June 1st, 2016, or yesterday, it gives you an idea that there's been 1 death, and that's now a bigger chunk of time from when we first looked at that data. So over an 80% reduction in sickle cell trait related death after the rule change. Just like the NCAA did heat acclimatization in 2003 with huge success, this has also had huge success in protecting athletes. TED Ague is the 1 death that took place in the time period since we've had the new exertional sickling policies. And important to look at with the TED Ague case, and this is very small and I apologize, but there's a point to this, is across the top I have things that tend to be very consistently there when someone dies during sporting events. So lack of education, improper exercise intensity, and not having an emergency action plan followed. On the left is a bunch of athletes, and here you can see the X's if that item was present when that athlete died. Cian Cola is a high school baseball player from Rhode Island. DJ Searcy, I mentioned, was a high school football player. But at the bottom is Ted Ague's case, and here you can see an example of almost all of those items being present during his particular case. He was at Cal Berkeley, football player, known to have sickle cell trait. He knew, and the people around him knew. Unfortunately, they did not have an AED there during his conditioning session where he had trouble. He struggled multiple times during the particular workout. They did a very hard repeat hill workout where people were tied together by a rope in teams of 10. So someone with sickle cell trait, that's an extremely bad idea because you want them to be able to change their intensity if they're not feeling well. And he was obviously not able to because he's being pulled along by everyone else. That particular hill is a brutal workout that they kept doing repeats. And if you know sickle cell trait, again, it's the repeated sprints with minimal recovery that causes the problems. And I could speak from experience. I went to that hill at the Berkeley campus. I did the workout that he did on that hill. I did the repeats, okay? And I did the same recovery. And I ran the distance from there also into where the AED actually was to time out that stuff. And you may have known soon after some of the work I did for his family, the university also, for the first time I've ever known, the university admitted negligence in that particular case publicly and has agreed to try to change things. Very rarely does a school admit that they did things wrong. So this is the document that came from the meeting that I mentioned. And there's a lot of detail in that document that I'm not going to get into right now, but the whole point is just to try to have smart workouts, especially during the first week. And having really smart, educated strength and conditioning coaches and team coaches and medical staff. So how can we make change happen faster? I mentioned to you in Arkansas before, in response to the 3 heat strokes, to their credit, they adapted cool first, transport second. The first state ever to do this. The EMT and EMS in Arkansas have to, for football in August, they have to cool the person on site before transporting them. They also require an immersion tub to be there, obviously, that falls in line. Emergency action plans are required, coaching education, AEDs, heat acclimatization, all of that happened within 2 years after they had those 3 really bad heat stroke situations. So the question is, how do we make the change happen faster without the athletes dying first? Can we be proactive instead of being reactive? So I just wanted to give you an example of 2 things we're doing at KSI. The last 2 years, we've hosted a youth sports safety governing bodies meeting where we've brought in leadership, medical leadership from like USA Soccer, USA Football, USA Track and Field, USA Swimming, all the different leading youth organizations in America for the 8 to 14-year-old athlete in America to try to mobilize them forward faster with policy changes. Similarly, and to the credit of the NATA and the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine, that we have established something called the Collaborative Solutions for Safety in Sports, where those organizations have provided the funding where we can bring 2 reps from every state, someone from the Sports Medicine Advisory Committee and someone from their state high school athletic association, to be in the same room at the same time. And the NFL hosted the first time, and the NCAA hosted this past year. So that we have the key 100 high school officials in the room at the same time so that we can move these policies more collectively forward. Because I told you of how kind of backbreaking it is to change policies state by state, each policy by policy. So to finish up my talk, it started in 1985 in terms of my interest with this particular topic of heat stroke and protecting athletes. And it takes me to 2015. And this is August 8th, 2015. And it's 30 years to the day after I had my heat stroke. And every 5 years on that day, I have a survival party. Okay? And this particular one was on the beach in Montauk on Long Island, and some close friends and family were able to attend. And the person in the middle there is Kent Scriber, the person who saved my life, which was obviously a great honor for me. I want to start to cry. But it was very, very, very powerful to have something like this. And it's a credit to my wife that she we're allowed to spend any amount of money to have my survival party. There's never a limitation, and she never questions anything related to survival party. I'm very happy that the next 5-year one is the day before the closing ceremonies at the Tokyo Olympics, so you know where I'll be for the next one. So, and that's me and my dear friend now, Ken Scriber. This is him when he visited. That was my uniform from my race back in 1985. I just want to, the mission of the Corey String Institute, maximize performance, optimize safety, and prevent sudden death for the athlete, soldier, and laborer. We work very closely also with our military and with laborers. This book just came out on the left if you're interested in some of these topics, preventing sudden death. Dr. Stearns, who's my colleague at UConn, co-authored that with me. I just want to say a quick thank yous. I know I've gone a couple minutes over, and I apologize. I'll blame Dr. Roberts. His intro was too long. I'm totally kidding. But a few thank yous I have to say that for a talk of this magnitude, I really wanted to take a chance. These are the key mentors that I've had in my life and key teachers. And I'm extremely thankful for all the people that are up here that have influenced my life up to this point. Obviously, my parents have been a godsend. I want to tell you quickly, if this is inspirational for anyone in the room, Ray Walsh is the second one listed there. He was my middle school track coach. Okay? The very first day I ever was at a track practice in my whole life in 8th grade, okay? I kind of recreationally ran. I took dead last in the 1-mile trial, okay? We each had to run 5 events to see what our event would be. I was dead last. He came up to me and he put his arm around me and he said, "Stick with this." He goes, "I think you could be a good runner someday." 6 years later, after I made All-State in New York, my senior year cross country, I got called to the principal's office and he had sent a note. He was by that time actually a principal of a school. He sent a note saying, "I'd been keeping track for 6 years. Congratulations on being All-State." So that was a great honor for me, and I definitely listened closely to his words. And thank you very much to the other people listed here. These are just some close collaborators, people I've published with, people who have inspired me, people I've had the chance to work with, maybe some other PhD students who I was not a major advisor of, just people who are great influences and have and continue to be great influences in my life. I see some of the people here right now, obviously like Fran O'Connor and Stavros Kavouris and others. That's quite powerful, the influence these and others people I've had in my life. Major advisors for PhDs, I want to just give a shout out. All the work that I've mentioned here and the research we do, it emanates really from them. Okay, this is the brains of the operation. And so these are the people I've been blessed to work with that I've graduated thus far in my career.